Thanks for joining us, everyone online. I'll just give it another couple seconds to fill up for the room. All right, thank you. Thanks for joining us. My name is Alexander Meliagru-Hitchens. I am the Research Director at the Program on Extremism. And I'm joined today by Linda Maisels, who's an independent scholar and whose recent book, What is Antisemitism? A Contemporary Introduction, was published in September 2022 by Routledge. She's an expert on a number of things, but today we're going to pick her brains a little bit about anti-Semitism, its history, as well as its kind of evolution and its current status. Our interest mostly today, and we've run a couple of sessions on this and published a bit around this, is how anti-Semitism is adopted by a range of extremist groups. And how actually, despite the differences among these extremist groups, let's say from leftist to jihadist to right-wing, the type of anti-Semitism that they espouse and that is within their ideology is actually quite similar. And they've all found a way to incorporate, or many of them have found ways to incorporate anti-Semitism into the core of their ideology. And Linda is going to discuss with us a little bit about how and why this happens and what it looks like. We're also hoping to be joined soon by our other panelist, Jacob Dorman. So I do apologize, he's not yet on with us, but as soon as he's able to join, he will jump on. But Linda, why don't you go ahead for now and maybe talk a little bit about your book and also about particularly this concept of intersectional anti-Semitism that we're trying to explore and get to know a little bit better.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for asking me to be on. I want to start this by jumping back to ancient history, 2016, when David Bernstein was installed as the head of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is part of the Jewish organizational world in the United States. And early on in his tenure, within a couple of weeks, he wrote an article for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and it was called The Anti-Israel Trend You've Never Heard Of. So in it, he brought up the concept of intersectionality. And as he wrote, it holds that various forms of oppression, racism, sexism, ableism, and homophobia constitute an intersecting system of oppression. In this worldview, a transcendent white male heterosexual power structure keeps down marginalized groups. So Bernstein's motive was not just to talk about intersectionality, he wanted to connect it to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement, which was definitely gaining currency and becoming much more visible on American college campuses. And so in particular, what Bernstein wanted to do was tie this concept, this academic concept of intersectionality, to the anti-Israel cause, as he referred to it, within the BDS movement that wanted to position Israel as part of this dominant power structure, and in doing so was oppressing Palestinians. So that was sort of his Bernstein's warning call. Now, this was one of many articles, but it hit at just the right cultural moment. I'm certain that at the time, very few outside of academia had heard of Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, which in 1989 was both groundbreaking and useful. In it, Crenshaw talked about the complex, you had to think of intersectionality as a concept that would be helpful within the complex structure of anti-discrimination law. She claimed there was a profound invisibility, for instance, for Black women or other women of color, because there was an overlapping of their racial and gender discrimination. And that the concept of intersectionality would illustrate how Black women were often marginalized by both feminist and anti-racist movements because their concerns didn't fit comfortably within either group. So this was something that was, fairly useful in the legal sphere and useful within academia, but Bernstein's article, and I'm convinced other factors as well, made it all of a sudden fly right into public consciousness, particularly within the Jewish community. I think we can think of it, people used intersectionality really without reading what Crenshaw had written, and it became a buzzword, kind of like critical race theory is today. So intersectionality was bandied about in many spheres as a sort of indictment against the left. But let me just flash forward then to 2017, when Bernstein, having given the matter more consideration, put out another article with the JTA, and the headline was "Intersectionality excludes and includes, and Jews must learn the difference. So here in it, he acknowledged that there had been a real firestorm with his first op-ed and that this was his corrective. In its original form, Bernstein said, intersectionality is a perfectly legitimate way to understand discrimination and power and can bring people together to talk about diverse identities. And this is something that Bernstein referred to as inclusionary intersectionality. However, he goes on that in its more malevolent form, it can be used to purge social justice causes of anyone who doesn't agree with the entire package of ideologically extreme views, and referred to that as exclusionary intersectionality. So this was sort of his olive branch to those particularly young students who found intersectionality a very useful concept, but also admitting or emphasizing that intersectionality was still being used to exclude Jewish students from the social justice movement, and often based or masked by animosity towards Israel, which was deemed to be, certainly on campuses, politically legitimate. So that's a very quick sort of capsule explanation. And intersectionality, I think, while people are very aware of it, has faded in favor of other sort of labels that people do throw at the left. So now I want to make this personal and jump forward to 2020, which was the start of the pandemic, and also the time, as you said, that I began writing my first book on anti-Semitism, which is really a broad survey of anti-Jewish animosity, beginning in classical antiquity and ranging to the present. Now, I'm a contemporary historian, so I made the assumption, which was correct, that writing historical chapters was going to be challenging for me. What I did not foresee is how difficult it was to get a clear read and a good format to present to my readers on the dynamics of contemporary anti-Semitism. I found it a real challenge, in particular, writing about anti-Semitism that stems from the political left. Why might this be? Well, I want to compartmentalize this into two issues. One of definitions, which is a subject that has been covered amply in other places, but I will touch on it, and also what I began to think of as a problem of intersectionality. So first, I want to just briefly outline the way my book was laid out, that I made three fairly rough generalizations to talk about contemporary anti-Semitism, one stemming from the Western world, the political left, one, the Western world, the political right, and one that stems from the Arab and Muslim worlds, generally, mostly the Middle East and North Africa. Now, I realize that in some senses, these are crude generalizations to fit into the contemporary landscape. Keep in mind that I was tracing these currents, again, from classical antiquity to the present. So I saw those as the three primary streams for anti-Semitism today. And definitionally, one of them was easy. Defining anti-Semitism on the political right is really, as I like to say, for reasonable people, rather simple. Most of us know that a swastika painted on a synagogue or a Jewish institution is a bad thing. And many of us also associate anti-Semitism on the political right with white supremacism and neo-Nazism. So this was easy to write, and there weren't too many political sensibilities that I might offend unless I talked about the blurring of the lines between the mainstream Western political right and the more extreme white supremacist right. That was my biggest pitfall. However, when you move into speaking about anti-Semitism on the Western political left and the Middle East, it's not as straightforward and also not as simple, of course, because of those movements' deep connection with both the Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. So how do you talk about these two movements while acknowledging that there is certainly legitimate criticism to be made of Israel and of Zionism, and also sometimes of the Western movements that support them? Completely legitimate. But what is the line between that and blatant anti-Jewish animosity or anti-Semitism? So what we've found is that there are attempts to offer definitions of anti-Semitism, the most broadly used being the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's, or the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, one that's used by our government and in particular the Department of State, or a sort of a permutation of that. But one's acceptance of that definition is really predicated on one's reactions to Israel and to Zionism. So for people who are predisposed, as many on the political left are, towards animosity towards Israel and Zionism, they don't want to accept that definition, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, because it is expansive. It asks us to look at problematic incidents in context before deeming them anti-Semitic or not. But the IRA definition is more open about its motive, or not, or one of its motives, which is to show that anti-Israel animosity can also be anti-Semitic. You can go the other way to the Jerusalem definition, which does not accept that and is much more likely to deem anti-Israel or anti-Zionist rhetoric and actions as not anti-Semitic. Again, this is something that's been covered in many other fora, so I won't go into that more deeply. But one thing I tried to do in my book was to talk about the intersectionality of anti-Semitism, and this is the way I see it. The problem on the left is not only the offensive actions or rhetoric that take place on the left. Clearly, in all of these streams, each of these streams will pretty much deny that they're anti-Semitic. Well, the political right, there's some pride in being anti-Semitic there. But the political left will deny its own offensive actions. But the other thing that I found interesting as I delved into this is that there is a seeming tolerance on the left for anti-Semitic expression that stems from the other two streams, the political right and the Arab and Muslim worlds. The other thing that I think we need to pay attention to is that all three streams use similar tactics. In other words, there is significant overlap or intersectionality in the way that animosity toward Jews is expressed. Let me give you just a couple of examples. So I think one problem is that all three streams employ similar tactics, the right, the left, and anti-Semitic currents in the Middle East and North Africa. So, for instance, just like the rest of the world, Nazi symbols are used. They might be used in different ways, but they do have a similar effect. So on the political right, for instance, Nazi symbols are used as a symbol of power and to threaten and to intimidate. On the left, however, they're used perhaps in a different way, also that can be intimidating, to shame. And this is a difference in tactic between the right and the left. So on the left, and also within the Middle East, North Africa movement, what you will see is direct equations between the state of Israel or Zionism and Nazi ideology or the Third Reich itself. Now, unfortunately, as we know from Godwin's law, just about everything is compared to the Nazis today. So again, we need to look at context as to whether or not this is anti-Semitic. According to the IRA definition, making that equation is anti-Semitic. It's also, if you don't want to accept that, offensive, and certainly historically inaccurate. The tragedy of the conflict between Israel and Palestinians is its own problem. It does not need to be amplified or distorted by comparison to the Nazi regime, with which it has very little commonalities. Another tactic beyond that is used by all three streams, of course, is the idea of the shadowy Jewish conspiracy. Now, if George Soros, for instance, is the boogeyman of the right, this Jewish financier that is behind everything, from allegedly from Black Lives Matter movements to funding illegal immigration, that's a problem for the right. However, we also see references to shadowy Jewish conspiracy and control on the left, and certainly within the Arab and Muslim Middle East and North Africa. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. That equation of Israel and Jews with money is certainly salient. Also, the idea that the Israel, or by extension, the Jewish lobby, is all powerful in controlling the conflict. And there also, certainly, we can see within Hamas's original charter that borrowed liberally from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So here we also see an overlap or intersectionality in the way that animosity is expressed. We might also say that exclusion is another tactic. In the 20th century in particular, I don't know that I would say the hard right, but the hard right plus the conservative, status quo of American society did exclude Jews, whether it was socially or professionally, from law firms or from country clubs. There was this idea of excluding Israel. What we see, while we don't see that certainly not as blatantly today, what we might see on the political left today, and particularly on college campuses, are social justice movements where Jewish students might be excluded from participation, not because they are deemed not progressive or not leftist, because of their support for Israel and Zionism, even if the cause is something completely unrelated to Israel. For instance, transgender rights. We also see in multilateral fora, for instance, the United Nations, and this might be more of a stretch, but Israel seemingly singled out as uniquely dangerous to the family of nations. Whereas we know, while Israel certainly has its problems, other nations do as well. And to concentrate specifically on Israel to the exclusion of others, I don't think that's whataboutism. I think that is, I think that's a contextual problem when you might have, for instance, a Human Rights Council exclusively focused on Israel's transgressions to the and masking those of other countries in the region or beyond. I think the other thing that we need to think about, and then I promise I will come to a close, is ignoring or minimizing the blatant anti-Semitism of the left, but also ignoring or minimizing anti-Semitism on the right or in Middle East streams, particularly to concentrate on other marginalized groups. Now, I think it's important that we recognize certainly that there are all kinds of people who are oppressed for all kinds of reasons, whether the color of their skin, their gender orientation, or because they are differently abled. We know that these are important concerns, but they can be addressed without minimizing or ignoring anti-Semitism. So for instance, when the left typecasts Israel, or in many cases Jews as well, as not only symbols of whiteness, but as paradigmatic symbols of whiteness and white power, not only is that problematic because it ignores thousands of years of anti-Semitism, but it also ignores that in contemporary white supremacist circles, Jews are marked as non-white. And not only that, are seen as key players in, for instance, conspiracy such as replacement theory, where people of color are seen as controlled by the Jews, and that the Jews have planned to flood Western countries with non-white immigration. Check out the Turner Diaries for a very early example of that in the 1970s. One other that I address in my book, I won't address it fully right now, is that, for instance, in Charlottesville, that there were progressive groups that, while they rightfully concentrated on the racism, the misogyny, the homophobia that was evident there, some of them completely ignored the anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic animosity there. One in particular that I highlight in my book, the National Women's Studies Association, actually had to go back and amend their statement because while they had rightfully condemned certain types of hate, they had left out anti-Jewish hate, even though it was quite prominent and easy to see. The last is that when violence is condemned in the Middle East, and unfortunately we're in a violent period today, even as I speak, I have personally no problem with anyone calling out Israel's excesses. This is freedom of speech. This is what we need to do. However, to do so one-sidedly, to rationalize or even glorify certain elements of violence from the other side is not giving a clear picture. And I think back also, for instance, to the Second Intifada, where encouraging or glorifying suicide bombing was an issue. So I want to wrap this up. In the end, I believe that the intersectionality of anti-Semitism ends with not all Jews, but many Jews feeling uneasy and isolated because they don't have a natural political home. If intersectionality as a theory was created to emphasize overlapping marginalities, then this intersectional component to contemporary anti-Semitism that I'm identifying seems constructed to marginalize Jews and often to make light of the genuine concerns they have about anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Linda. That was really useful summary there. It throws up a lot of important questions. Just for the audience, just so you know, we also invite you to ask questions at the bottom of your screen there. You'll see a Q&A box. You can enter questions, and once we finish our discussion in the next 10-15 minutes, I will go through questions from the audience. So please do feel free to start putting your questions in. I had a couple of comments and questions, Linda. I guess, going back to the start of your talk about how you have looked at this from over almost ancient history now. I guess one of the questions is, and I mean, I accept this is a big question. How much how has anti-Semitism, I suppose, changed? What are the key ways, if at all, anti-Semitism has changed from its kind of, let's say, original form to today? And does that, to an extent, help us understand the intersectionality of it, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And actually, that is the way that my book runs. I use something that I call the onion model, which is that anti-Semitism, as it has built up, is in concentric layers. And actually, you need to identify two onions. One of them is in the what I call roughly the Christian influenced world. Not saying that all Christians are anti-Semitic, but in the world as it developed in the West, and one that would be influenced by Islam. And again, very careful to say that not all of Islam is anti-Semitic. And within these two onions, what you can do is you can take out one layer. So you could look at medieval anti-Jewish animosity, or you can look at a succession of layers and how they build upon each other. And why am I forgetting the name now? I'm looking for the book on my shelf. David Nierenberg is someone who really illuminated this, that even that you have echoes of anti-Semitism that I also see in my onion layers. So if in classical pre-Christian antiquity, you have a fear of Jews as the other, then layered upon that, you have Christian animosity towards Jews that includes, of course, deicide, the killing of God, and then layering into that also usury and money lending. And then you get into, post-Enlightenment as you get into a less religious world. And all of a sudden, people realize that hating Jews for religious reasons based on that, deicide or, that religious argument, even people who were so-called, enlightened, who were secular and rational thinkers in the 19th century, still found Jews to be an alien other. And while they weren't religious themselves, the echoes of that animosity that was expressed through the Catholic Church and through Christianity come out in their repositioning of Jews. And this begins in the 19th century and certainly culminates in many ways with World War II and Nazi genocide, was Jews as racially different. And of course, we do see some of that again in this argument about whether or not Jews are white. That's a racial argument. All of these, so Jews as the other, Jews as racially different, Jews as religiously different, they build upon each other. They speak to each other, even when we're not aware of them. They're simply part of the background of our culture. There's a similar phenomenon that's actually in many ways simpler to describe, that in the Arab and Muslim world, influenced by Islam, you had Jews who were not seen as dangerous and threatening, certainly, and there was no accusation of deicide within the Muslim tradition, but Jews, along with Christians and also polytheists, were seen as inferior, and that was built into interactions. And then, of course, what happens there is that you have a layering on of the competing Jewish and Arab nationalisms, Zionism, and certainly post-World War I, that emerging of Arab nationalism, which is modeled on currents that came over from Europe. Essentially, there is layering there too, and it is my contention that in the contemporary world, we have the meeting of these two onions and their layers. And so animosity towards Israel can be expressed using religious terms. For instance, the Palestinian Via Dolorosa, which calls to mind, of course, the killing of God, or it can be expressed racially. It can be expressed through conspiracy theory. Jews and anti-Semitism are very convenient vehicles for targeting and blaming forces that are beyond our control.
Yes, interesting on what you mentioned in terms of the kind of Arab anti-Semitism. Because in the past I've looked comparatively at sort of white supremacist and jihadist ideologies as both kind of fundamentally reactionary, anti-liberal movements who both have quite a shared sense of what the problem is and have obviously different solutions to it. And yet one of the things that struck me, of course, was that the kind of violent anti-Semitism of both of them, ideologies that I think you could argue you can't really remove anti-Semitism from them without fundamentally changing them. I'm not sure, and I'd be interested in what you thought about in terms of, and if, leftism can mean many things, but let's say, radical left, Antifa types perhaps. I felt like you could possibly remove anti-Semitism from them, and still they would maintain their character and their ideology in a way that it doesn't quite. You couldn't say that for the extreme right and the jihadists. But I wonder what you thought about that. But what also struck me was that really jihadist anti-Semitism, so the type of things you would see people from bin Laden, up until ISIS today say, are really very close and heavily influenced by the kind of European anti-Semitism that you've discussed. So, for example, I think a lot of assumptions have been in the past that, that jihadi anti-Semitism comes from their literal interpretation of the primary text, the Quran and Hadith. But of course, there's nothing really in there that says Jews run the world, right? Or has that, right? That is really a European kind of racist invention. And so they, in going even back to sort of Islamist thinkers like Sayyid Qutb, really what they were saying was basically kind of Nazi anti-Semitism repackaged. And very little of it actually was that linked to their religion. Other aspects of jihadi ideology is linked to how they interpret Islam. But interestingly, of course, Jews are mentioned in Quran Hadith, but the kind of animosity towards Jews is usually more about specific Jewish tribes that Muhammad and his followers and successors were fighting, in certain periods, rather than Jews, all Jews. So I thought that was a kind of interesting. Something interesting that I noticed when looking at this. So I wondered what you thought, firstly, about the kind of inherent aspect of anti-Semitism in jihadism and the extreme right compared to the left. Would you agree that there's a difference in how integral it is to their belief system, or perhaps you disagree? And also maybe your thoughts on sort of the exporting of European racist anti-Semitic, racist views of Jews to the Arab world.
Let me start with the second question, because in a way that's easier for me. It's something that I addressed in my book. Within this onion model, yes, the core of it is writings in the Quran and Hadith, which can be both laudatory of Jews and Judaism, it can be derogatory, and it can also be somewhat neutral. But really, Jews not seen as a threat, in some ways, seen as rather incompetent and foolish for not recognizing the word of God as channeled through the Prophet Muhammad. So there's not that sense of threat that you might get in Christian writings, certainly, or even in the Christian Bible. And what I see is, and other scholars see certainly, is that throughout the course of the 18th, 19th century, as you have European incursions, they bring their physical presence, but they also bring ideology. So, European style nationalism comes in. That's also when European style anti-Semitism creates another onion layer. It's not indigenous to the Middle East. And one of the ways you see that is the Damascus blood libel in 1840. Blood libel was not something that I think there may have been rare instances of it, but it wasn't indigenous to that area. And this is something that was imported. The idea that Jews used ritual sacrifice, depending on the area, of Christian or Muslim children, and used their blood either for ritual purposes, that's ritual murder, or consumed it. At a certain point, it changes to actual consumption, being baked into, for instance, matzahs for the holiday of Passover. Once that layer is established, that's a very useful layer, particularly as you bring in racial anti-Semitism from Europe that talks about conspiracy theory. What better way to explain the successes of the new state of Israel than conspiracy theory? So when you get to, as you mentioned, Sayyid Qutb's writings on the Jews, in the 1970s, a copy of that was released by Saudi Arabia that included commentary taken from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So the Protocols is a forgery, a document that was created in Eastern Europe, probably in Russia, and spread throughout Europe and also the United States, alleging that, a secret cabal of Jews was in control of world governments, the economy, etc. And this is a very useful fiction, once again, for seeing how the Jews, a degraded and humbled people who were not accepting of the word of God, became so successful. So if you walk the streets of, Cairo, Beirut, wherever else, it's fairly simple to see, find in Arabic copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is not indigenous to the area. So I think that's one thing that layering explains, is that this has definitely been imported. For within the Arab and Muslim Middle East, to criticize Israel makes sense, but there can also be, as you said, hearkening back to animosity from Jewish tribes in Medina, right? That's one other way of framing the conflict, is that Jews are traitors because of the ways they betrayed and didn't listen to Muhammad in that, essentially, as he was beginning his rise. So all of that can play into, and often does, contemporary complaints about Israel. So that's one. Going back to whether or not I think, yes, that certainly for the white supremacist right, and scholars like Eric Ward talk about this, anti-Semitism is absolutely integral to that. And jihadist, yes, I think that using Israel as a rallying point, even let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, where the ideological connections aren't as strong, you can use Israel and Jews as a rallying point, even for people who this was not originally their issue. As far as the left, I think that's a great question, and I think it's an interesting question. There is a long tradition of animosity towards Jews on the left, beginning, certainly with the Enlightenment, and when you have debates, let's say in France, after the French Revolution, about whether or not Jews can be counted as citizens. What you see is that, the right obviously says, no, a Jew can never be a full citizen of France. They're Jewish. They are problematic. They are not like us. They are a foreign other. The left says, hang on a second. Jews can actually be citizens if they renounce much of their Judaism that makes them distinguished. And the famous quote from that is that and of course now I can't remember it, and it's so famous I can't remember it, that Jews, as individuals can be citizens of France, but as a nation, as a separate other, they cannot be. And that is why, to this day, maybe not so much today, but it was that, certainly around the time of the condemnation and the jailing of Alfred Dreyfus, that the Jewish community in France, they saw themselves as Israelites. They were Jewish by religion, French by nationality. But the left was never, at that time, was certainly not pro-Jewish. They were saying, yeah, we can see they're coming out of the ghetto, we can assimilate them, but they have to give up much of their distinctive Jewishness. And I think there's an echo of that in the hard left today, that there is an annoyance with Jewish issues, that you are certainly welcome. There are good Jews who are welcome in leftist movements, progressive movements, as long as you give up any affinity to Israel, and also if you play down your particular Jewishness. We don't want to talk about anti-Semitism. We want to emphasize the problems of people of color. We want to emphasize gender issues. And again, as I said earlier, there's nothing wrong with emphasizing these issues. But when you talk to certain college students, they say that they are welcome as long as they are not overt in their Jewishness. So there is a line there. It might not be as integral. Some might also say, and this is my last point, in the 60s and 70s, when you had, this was really, and Jewish students were disproportionately represented in the counterculture, in leftist movements at that time. And the 67 war was kind of a breaking point when all of a sudden Israel became unacceptable. Today, and that was, even though I think that students at that time had more to concentrate on civil rights and the Vietnam War, leftist students today are fragmented in many ways. Israel does provide one thing that just about everybody can agree on. And so while it might not be integral, it's terribly useful.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, useful way of understanding that. You mentioned the blood libel, and again, I don't know if I suppose ancient belief is certainly a very old one. do you see versions of it today? So if we were to think about kind of extremist conspiracy theorist types in the US and around the world, particularly in America, from that QAnon world, who have been driven primarily by a belief in the sort of underground child abuse claims, the sort of Hillary Clinton conspiracy theories around, Pizzagate, beginning with that, and today continuing sort of the Save Our Children, this idea that particularly leftists or Democrats are involved in trafficking children and all of this. And that's, of course, fueled, that fantasy is fueled by the reality of, the Jeffrey Epstein stories and things like this. Do you see a link between the kind of anti-Semitism of the blood libel with this kind of current, suppose, moral panic about children supposedly being trafficked by the left, and often by Jewish, powerful Jews like George Soros?
Yeah, I think it's definitely there. And listen, the blood libel too exists and it's protected political commentary that, you can see caricatures of, let's say, Prime Minister Netanyahu eating the head of a baby or whatever it might be. And you see this connection, certainly, of Jews to blood and to rapacious killing, let's say, to murder, and also of preying on children. If you believe, I'm just thinking that in the Trump campaign, there was a widely criticized ad that came out that showed Hillary Clinton with Jewish stars, which it was later claimed they were, sheriff badges. I don't buy that. It was Jewish stars and dollar signs. So if you believe that the Democratic Party and liberals in general are controlled by that Jewish conspiracy, and you also make the unfortunate link to, pedophiles and predators like Jeffrey Epstein, who happen to be Jewish, or Harvey Weinstein. This is very problematic. These are people who did, donate money to Democratic causes. Then it's just a very short leap to, if someone can't consciously say, oh, the blood libel, it's right back there in your cultural consciousness because it's all around you. So yes, I think that's definitely a tie-in.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to a final question for me, and then we have a couple from the audience. So yeah, I think if you were to perhaps confront someone out on the street holding a placard saying, save our children, who has bought into this idea that there is a sort of secret child trafficking cabal, and you were to tell them, actually, that what you are saying is rooted in anti-Semitism, they might be quite surprised or shocked that they might not think of themselves as anti-Semitic. They might not have realized that the kind of connotations and history and roots of this. And it reminded me of, there's a book just recently published by a British scholar and activist called Dave Rich, who is one of the senior people at the Community Security Trust in the UK. And his book called Everyday Hate, How Anti-Semitism is Built into Our World, How You Can Change It, essentially talks about this issue of the mainstreaming or the sort of seeping of anti-Semitic tropes and ideas into discussions, into people's beliefs, without them actually realizing what they're saying is actually incredibly anti-Semitic. We've had this reckoning with racism to an extent, people waking up more to racist tropes and beliefs that they've held for a long time and didn't even really question them or think about or realize that they were racist, and a lot of people quite shocked to be called that after, later on. Do you I wonder firstly what you thought generally about this idea, and also what would you say are the kind of most common or say acceptable dinner table views that actually are really quite anti-Semitic and or if not, are rooted in it? What would you say are the kind of things that perhaps the audience would be interested to hear, or keep an ear out for, that the kind of common stuff that people may say with that they don't realize just actually how anti-Semitic it is?
First of all, I want to say I have a lot of respect and admiration for Dave Rich, who does terrific work. I haven't read his new book, but I know that it's on my list, and that's something that I need to do. Yeah, I think that I'm most familiar with what happens in this country, and I know that the UK is often has some slight but still significant differences. So I'm going to speak mostly from an American perspective, and here. Jews, I think, feel differently than they might in European countries. Jews are a minority there at this point, less than 2% of the population, but they have been, in the aggregate, remarkably successful and in very visible professions. Now, certainly, and people do refer to that because it's things like Hollywood and, the media, and you do see a lot of Jews in that. We don't talk about the overrepresentation of Protestants in the insurance industry. That's not seen as a danger, but it's just not as visible. So Jews do have a certain visibility. Jews also were protected in many ways throughout American history from being the minority, as they might have been in European countries. So the existence of Native Americans, the existence of African Americans, the existence of other people, Asian Americans, other people of color, blunted the emphasis on Jews. Plus, this is a very populous country, and Jews were always very small numbers. They were concentrated in certain areas. So you can see the movie, for instance, School Ties, which came out with Brendan Fraser, I think in the 90s, the OOs, and it showed that there are very different ways that animosity to Jews was expressed. There's sort of the rough and tumble, the Italian American and Irish American neighborhoods next to the Jewish American neighborhood in New York. There was friction there, sometimes actual physical friction. And that was very different from the social anti-Semitism that might have been keeping successful Jews out of country clubs or schools when there were quotas at universities, things like that. So anti-Semitism displayed itself in different ways. In rural areas, it was less of an issue because the Jews in this country were largely not a rural people. But something also that we need to confront that we don't talk about very much is anti-Semitism that exists within other marginalized communities. Now, certainly within the Jewish community, you need to talk about racism, transphobia, whatever else, but you need to also look at anti-Semitism in the African American community or for Latino American, whatever it might be. So there's that dynamic as well. I think I've lost the thread of what you asked me. I was trying to demonstrate the difference.
I suppose it was what do you think are the kind of some of the most common acceptable, as it were, dinner table views
right.
That actually really need to be re-examined?
I think that a lot of times, Jews, again, and this goes back to the idea that Jews, for most people, they don't know the long history of anti-Jewish oppression and blatant anti-Semitism other than the Holocaust. So anything other than the Holocaust is seen as, Jews they're white, they're successful, they make a lot of money, they probably make too much money. Their concerns are not our concerns. What is discounted and not understood is the power of conspiracy theory, as I tried to speak about earlier. Jews becoming, even though Jews becoming, say, a symbol of whiteness or a symbol of non-whiteness, Jews as a symbol not only of predatory capitalism, but also socialism, which I have to say most people in this country don't really have a great grasp of what socialism is, other than it is bad, but that can be represented by Jews. It's that, I think we say it's a protean quality or it's a malleability that Jews and Judaism, and to a certain extent Israel, can be representative of all kinds of evils. So things can be casually tossed out there. We also see, I think, a resurgence today of, expressions like to Jew people down, the idea that Jews are both social, terrible social climbers butting in where they're not wanted, or they are clannish and insular and keep to themselves. So all of this is out there. And for people who don't know the long history of anti-Semitism, it doesn't quite compute. It's a difficult story to tell. And when I teach, say, a quarter-long or semester-long course on anti-Semitism, you have students, and most of the people who take my courses are not Jewish, saying, gosh, I never realized that this idea that I held that all Jews have money, or Jews are white oppressors, that is extraordinarily problematic. So I think that there is really an ignorance that is hard to fill in, because I can't say to everybody, hey, come take my 10-week class, and then you will see why a picture of Netanyahu eating the intestines of a Palestinian child as an image has a resonance that goes beyond mere political comment, and why it's dangerous.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I think you mentioned as well kind of perhaps Jews being overrepresented in certain fields and industries. And I think even that probably you can link to anti-Semitism in the sense that these are the industries that they were sort of allowed into, that they weren't barriers. And you could probably say the same about people of color as well in some of those industries. It's where society allowed them to be. And it was where the fewest obstacles were. And I think that probably better explains why you've got them in those industries than any other thing, than any sort of inherent trait, right?
People will argue about that, and they will say, I had the best time. I sat with my father is a retired lawyer. He's in his 80s, and we just presented at a conference on the law versus anti-Semitism at Lewis and Clark College. And we talked about the overrepresentation of Jews in the legal profession, which some scholars see coming to an end. That if your grandfather was an immigrant, a peddler, or maybe had a shop of some kind or a small business, and your father was a lawyer, the child is off in Brooklyn opening a vegan bakery. It's just sort of progression that the law was, as you said, a place where Jews could make their mark. But because of the rate, certainly in this country, of assimilation and acculturation, Jews don't need the law in the same way. Nevertheless, the stereotype of the sharp Jewish lawyer is still with us.
Yes. So I'll just read I'll read a question from the audience here. This is an interesting one. I think, can you discuss the intersectional anti-Semitism, particularly from left, right, and within kind of Islamism, has created and influenced anti-Semitism that may be found between different sects of Judaism? And I don't know if perhaps that's a reference to kind of Nature Carta types. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Let me see if I understand the question correctly, that those expressions, outside expressions of anti-Semitism, have brought up maybe conflict between different Jewish groups. Yeah, I think that Neturei Karta is an excellent example, because that is an anti-Zionist, traditional Haredi or Orthodox, traditional Orthodox group that does not would stand with, say, the country of Iran in opposing Zionism in Israel. That certainly exists. Listen, to bring it onto a different plane, you have the mainstream Jewish community is a continuum, and we're always debating how broad the tent should be of who's included under the broad tent of the Jewish organizational world. And on the left, that probably stretches to, let's say, J Street, which is critical of Israel and Zionism, all the way to the Zionist Organization of America, which is on the right and completely supportive of Israel and Zionism. And so that's a broad spectrum, and different Jewish communities will find different expressions from those groups acceptable or not acceptable. In the middle, you have, let's say, more like the ADL, or the American Jewish Committee. So there's this continuum of discussion. But what you see on, for instance, campuses is Jewish Voice for Peace, which for many people is too far on the left in its anti-Zionist proclamations, is not seen as part of mainstream Jewish opinion. However, on campuses, Jewish Voice for Peace is seen as a legitimate and a sought-after group. So what you might see on a college campus is a panel about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where Jewish representation is satisfied not by ideological differences, by actually putting someone right-wing on a panel, but you sort of cover your bases by using someone from Jewish Voice for Peace who might be in agreement with other anti-Israel voices on the panel. Now, this is fine. Jewish Voice for Peace has a legitimate right to express their opinions, but they are not necessarily representative of the broad mainstream. And that causes conflict outside of the Jewish community and within. The Jewish community has a long history too of, it's very easy to call people with whom you disagree a self-hating Jew or whatever else. So this is a problem within the Jewish community that we see, but it's also a problem where appropriate Jewish representation is mandated by outside forces. And that doesn't necessarily, similarly, I think you could say that if you ask only the Zionist Organization of America to sit on the panel, that does not express the broad continuum of Jewish thought. So I don't know how we call that, where that fits in with anti-Semitism, but it is rather difficult when outside non-Jewish forces deem who's a good Jew and who's a bad Jew according to their views.
Yes, yeah, that's very interesting. So this one, you may not have researched this area, so feel free to say so. But this is one question looking particularly at the sort of male supremacist kind of online movements, incel types. Question is there anything from your research that can speak to the way anti-Semitism is spread among individuals who are positioned within the male supremacist belief system? Anti-Semitism is common, particularly within online incel communities, though the connection with misogynist belief is not always obvious. So I suppose, yes, is there a connection between it, and speaking again on that intersectional question, between hypermasculinity or misogynist beliefs and anti-Semitism? Do you think there's an inherent link there?
Sure. I think that there are gateway ideologies and that we see that there are. I know that David Duke, as far back as the 70s, 80s, talked about it was easy to pull in white Southerners to talk about the problem of, African Americans. Once you pulled them in that way, you could expose them to anti-Semitic ideology. And I think that incels, and this is not my primary area of research, but I've heard other people talk about this. Yes, you're pulling in people who are disaffected and angry about their position in society. And to blame women, you can certainly also point out, the overrepresentation of Jews within the feminist movement. And then once people are enticed by this idea of women being my problem, well, all kinds of things are your problem. Gosh, 50 years ago, as a white man, before a lot of these cultural upheavals, you were the top of the heap. Why aren't you now? There are people of color, there are women, there's all this transgender supposed nonsense, and there are Jews. There are always Jews. And again, I think I already mentioned him, but Eric Ward is terrific. Eric Ward writes about far-right movements, and he said, make no mistake that any of these far-right movements, that anti-Semitism and the problem of the Jews is always at its core, no matter what draws you in.
Yes, and I guess, like you said, when you're dealing with a community who are feeling very aggrieved, or it's to say a group of people feeling very aggrieved and we're looking for someone to blame and who are extremely online, the chances that they fall upon Jewish people as the kind of way of diagnosing their own problems are pretty high, because they are residing already in parts of the internet that are steeped with those kind of politics. So they're very vulnerable to it. I think that's the way around to look at it, possibly. We have just one last question. So this is actually, I suppose, a good way to end it. In terms of what do we do about it? Someone asks here, from a contemporary historical perspective, are there effective means to counter conspiracy theories like blood libel and great replacement? How should practitioners respond to these conspiracies that may seem ludicrous to rational people, but are believed by a lot of people?
This is the $64,000 question, isn't it? I'm going to default in a way to how I ended my book, and I think of my colleague David Hirsch, who's at King's College. I think I'm going to misrepresent that. I'll just say he's my colleague, and he says we need to make democracy sexy again. Democracy is fundamentally dull. There's little that's sexy about it. There is debate, there is certain argument, and there's probably an over-reliance on experts, all things that certainly in this country are not seen as positive today. The problem with conspiracy theory is that I think it can be two things. It's an easy answer to a complex problem, or sometimes it's a very complicated answer that makes people feel like they have specialized knowledge to problems that are really much more dull. It's like sort of launching James Bond into something where really all you need is, a good teacher or a good, security officer, whatever it might be. So it's not easy, but it is, to me, Jews have thrived, and particularly in the United States, where liberal institutions, not leftist, not rightist, but liberal institutions that encourage very boring discussion, debate, and the idea of consensus, that we don't get into politics to become a winner. We get in to find a compromise that will be mutually acceptable to as many people as possible. No owning the libs or anything like that. And I think that if we do not continue to delve and not to be afraid of our own past, history is contentious and difficult, to try as accurately as possible to look at our past transgressions, but not to rely on that. I will end by remembering that I had the good fortune to travel to Ghana, and I got to visit one of the slave castles on the Ghanaian coast. We had a wonderful Ghanaian guide who was exposing some real horrors. It was a painful place to visit, particularly as an American, knowing our past history. But he had a wonderful way to end. He said, we must talk about these problems. We must expose them. We must, without hopefully, without casting aspersion on people who are alive today and were not alive then, we need to look towards the future and working together. And I know that seems really sort of sappy, but we need to reinvigorate the idea of not seeing people who have different political views as us as the enemy, but rather someone with a differing opinion. And for heaven's sakes, while you're doing that, try very hard not to position Jews as that sort of paradigm or that symbol of that group you're thinking of as the enemy. Different opinions, but hopefully we're all working towards the same conclusion, which is a fair, a just, perhaps even more equal society.
Yeah, perfect timing, a great response. Yeah, and I think just to say, the only way, the most successful and prosperous societies today and governments and cultures, they are the ones that are not sweeping their past under the rug or pretending they didn't happen. That's not to say they're getting it all perfectly right, but are the ones that are in some way or other confronting it, at least accepting that it's real and that it happened. You can look in other parts of the world where atrocities have been, if not swept under the rug, have been re-energized and celebrated again. So that that's something to really bear in mind. But thanks again very much, Linda Maisels. Really useful conversation. Unfortunately, we didn't get to discuss another aspect of this, which was the Black Hebrew Israelites, but we will be trying to rearrange a talk on that as well. I'm sure you'll be interested on that. But yes, thank you to everyone. Thanks for joining, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.